Hello and welcome back to another episode of Creedal. I'm here with my friend Larry Chapp to talk through some of the things that he observed while he was in Rome recently for the Synod on Synodality. Larry, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Zac. It was great. We met for the first time in person at the Catholic Imagination Conference at Notre Dame last weekend.
That's right.
And there I was sitting, and I looked up, and oh my God, it's Zac Crippen. So
I heard somebody say Zac, and then turned, and there was Larry Chapp. So yeah, that was a surprise. We had not coordinated prior to that. I didn't know you were attending. I think it was a relatively last minute decision on your part, right?
Yeah, it was very last second because I had intended to be, speaking of the Synod, I was supposed to stay in Rome until the 31st of October to be there for the very end of the Synod. But I ended up leaving early on October 22nd. I had written my last dispatch for First Things and for Catholic World Report. And I just thought, well, I've done my bit for king and country. The Synod is really boring. There's not much more you can say about it. And so I was ready to come home. Rome is great, but I was ready to come home.
Yeah. Understandable. Well, it was nice to see you. I know you drove several hours from your farm in Pennsylvania out to South Bend, Indiana, which is much closer to my home. But
it's about an 8 or 9 hour drive. Yeah, not too bad.
Doable in a day, but you still feel.
Well, it's all Interstate 80 the whole way too.
Yeah.
It's simple. Yeah.
The only thing about that route is all the tolls add up on that interstate all the way across the state. Are you on the Pennsylvania Turnpike as well, or are you north of?
No, 80 through Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And that's free, and then it's toll in Ohio and Indiana. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah.
But I use Easy Pass, and my wife pays it off her credit card, so
nice.
I never see what it's actually costing.
Just free travel for you. I love it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, it was great to see you. So that conference, to my listeners, it was the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame, and they host this wonderful conference every year. This was the first year I've attended, but I have many friends who have attended in years past. And so when we have told friends that we were moving to this area, they said, "Oh, you got to go to the CEC, Center for Ethics and Culture conference." So every year there's a new theme, and the themes tend to be very ambiguous, I think, because they want to have a very sort of big tent approach to Catholic ethics and culture. So they want to be able to invite all kinds of presenters from across the disciplines every year. So this year the theme was Catholic imagination. I forget, they announced the theme for next year already, but it was similarly like very ambiguous. I think it was the living tradition was the theme for next year.
Oh, is it? I did not hear that. That's good to hear.
I think so. Yeah.
Is there a date? Did they announce a date?
That I don't know. Yeah. I wasn't at the dinner where they announced this, but people.
I wasn't either. Yeah. So maybe, yeah. Well, because I'm definitely, it's my first time as well. And we need to move on to the Synod. But I just want to say it really is, somebody described it as Catholic Woodstock, and that's exactly what it is.
That's great.
They set a record this year. Over 1,200 people were in attendance. And I mean, it was great fun for me because, I've been around the block a few times, not my first theological rodeo, and I know tons and tons and tons of people in the Catholic Theological Guild who I haven't seen in some cases 20 or 30 years, and there they were, and as well as young folks like yourself. So that to me was beyond the greatness of the talks. It was just the fact that it really is a meeting place for Catholics.
Yeah, it was fun to run into you there, obviously, but then it was also fun to be hanging out with you a little bit, and you're waving to all your friends and saying hi to these folks you haven't seen in many years and introducing me to some of them. So, I mean, you and I were going to go to this talk by Carl Trueman, or this kind of panel with Carl Trueman on it. Carl Trueman, who's at Grove City College, he's a Reformed scholar. I'm actually, you've probably read this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. This is a Trueman.
That's right.
Trueman
it's
book.
on my shelf. It's on my shelf over here.
Yeah, so I haven't read it all. I'm reading it. I
have,
but
it's great.
It's very good. And so we wanted to go hear him, but I think he couldn't attend the conference at the last minute. So you and I ended up going to see a presentation by Liz Lev and her husband Thomas. What's his last name?
Williams?
He's escaping me. Yeah, I think that sounds right. Yeah. And so that was wonderful, just about the portrayal of death through art in the Catholic imagination, and that was very, very eye-opening.
Liz Lev is great. I had dinner with her in Rome. She's stationed in Rome. She does tours in Rome, so big plug for Liz Lev. If you ever go to Rome and you want to do a tour of the great art of Rome, you need to hook up with Elizabeth Lev, L-E-V.
Yeah, really amazing. So that was a fun time to see you. But when I was meeting with you, you told me that you had been at the Synod and that you had been doing this writing assignment for First Things, appended to George Weigel's letters from the Synod in each issue of First Things. On, I guess even more than each issue is on a every other day basis or something like that. Pretty common or pretty frequent. Yeah. You had a synod diary appended to that. So it was you and George Weigel, basically dispatches from the synod. I had no idea this was going on. To be honest, Larry, I have found the Synod on Synodality to be sort of a paper tiger in the way that traditionalists have talked about it, and to just rather become obnoxious. And so I've mostly tuned out most things around the Synod on Synodality. But when you told me that you were doing these dispatches, I looked them up and read through some of your work there and thought it was great. So I thought, well, Larry, have you come on and talk to us about what you saw at the Synod on Synodality?
Well, thanks. First off, I want to say this. I just in a nutshell. I know it's cliche, but I think that the synod eventually did turn out to be a big nothing burger. That's what a lot of people say. Oh, that's a big nothing burger. I would use stronger language, but it's a family show, so I won't. But the fact is I don't think it was a foregone conclusion that it was going to end up as a nothing burger.
Yeah.
Because I think what happened was there were a set of expectations that the synod organizers over the past 3 years placed on the synodal process. And I think those expectations were that there was going to be a clear indication, a sort of groundswell of support for certain changes in the Church's moral theology, in her sacramental theology with regard to the ordination of women. I really think they thought this was going to lay the foundation for those changes. It didn't happen. Another change they wanted was for Episcopal conferences to be granted doctrinal authority, in some ways independent from Rome. And obviously the Germans wanted that, and other Europeans wanted that. That got tremendous pushback as well, and ended up being dialed back. Now, I want to just toot my own horn a little bit, and that of George Weigel, and a range from Jonathan Liedl at the Register to the guys writing in the Pillar and other venues, podcasts such as yours. I think that those of us who were involved in the criticism of the synodal way, as the Vatican was proposing it, led to the synod failing, in a sense, to achieve what I think were its original expectations. I'm not saying I did that. I'm saying that this cloud of people that rose up and said, here's the dangers associated with the synod, I think caused a lot of the synod participants to take notice. I think the synod participants were reading a lot of this stuff and watching a lot of these podcasts and saying to themselves, these people have a point. And so they pushed back. And obviously, the synod participants, many of them had minds of their own as well. That's why they were synod participants. They were people of note, who were invited to come to the synod. And so I just think a combination of a lot of factors led to the synod, in a sense, not meeting those expectations. So that's great. And as a sign, and then I'll shut up, as a sign, I think that even the Pope was perhaps done with the synodal process at the end of it, was that he didn't even write an apostolic exhort after 3 years and 2 major synods. Unlike other synods, he did not write an apostolic exhortation at the end to sort of sum up his thoughts on the affair. He just signed Pope Francis. He signed his name on the final synodal document, thus granting it magisterial authority. But I mean, geez, come on. Are you kidding me? The whole process gets done and all we get is a papal signature without, any further comment. Furthermore, within days of the synod being done, he issues a new encyclical on the Sacred Heart, which kind of sucks all the air out of the room because now everybody's just focused on the new, which, by the way, is a great encyclical, I think, a very good encyclical. And it's just like at the end of 2023, 1 week after the synod was over, they issue Fiducia Supplicans, without any consultation, without letting anybody at the synod know that they were writing Fiducia Supplicans on gay blessings or whatever. It's almost as if the Vatican was operating over here by a set of rules and the synod over here thinking they were doing something special. In point of fact, the Vatican was laughing at it the whole time, as if those people really matter at the end of the day. It's just unbelievably confusing as to what the entire thing actually even meant.
Well, I have a couple thoughts slash questions on that. First, you mentioned all these sort of people who've been writing about this and sort of sounding the alarm, and you really think that had a material effect at the end of the day. I noticed all those people that you named are lay people. I think there are a couple of clergymen who have been doing a similar work, but it's interesting to me that actually I think it would be obviously an overstatement to say lay people changed the church or saved the church, but I think it is cool to see Vatican II's vision of an engaged laity defending the church coming to fruition and seeing lay people really actively involved in this and not simply being passive participants and just sort of going where the clerics tell them to go. So that's nice, and it's inspiring to see our fellow churchmen and women who are lay people standing up and doing that. People like yourselves. Or people like yourself. The second thing is give us some context here. Is the synodal process actually done? Because I was reading George Weigel's sort of introduction to the letters from the synod, and in that he said that the most controversial of the proposals seem to have been sort of tabled for later discussion, and the committees that are working on them are going to kind of wrap up their stuff after the synod actually is done.
But these are extra synodal committees in the sense that they really are not part of the synodal process. These are Vatican these are committees established by the Vatican and then staffed by Vatican appointment. These are not committees filled with people that were voted on by local episcopal conferences or lay people. In other words, this is not the people of God speaking in listening sessions to create this groundswell of committees that are going to, no, this was a top-down autocratic imposition from the Vatican. We're going to do these committees on these topics with these people. So yeah, George is right. George Weigel's right. In some ways, the major hot button issue questions, such as women deacons or the reform of moral theology, are not closed. They're still on the table and they're still going to be discussed. But the synod is going to have nothing to do with it. And that's the only point I'm making about the synod. And it's also the point about why I said the synod is so confusing, because the synod reached conclusions X, Y, Z, and those conclusions in no way matched the liberal fantasy camp. And yet now, okay, the synod's done, but we're gonna keep the whole liberal fantasy camp going over here via these various committees. Well, then just why not start the committees and to hell with the synodal process? Why not just say, here's what we're aiming for and let's have at it? It's just the lack of transparency. It's the gamesmanship here that is just so annoying. Can we just be adults and have an adult conversation instead of these silly Vatican games? And that's what's being played here. It's a game.
So this, I'm going to ask you to speculate here, but is your sense that the synod was begun obviously by the Vatican, initiated by Pope Francis, inaugurated by Pope Francis, with a real vision towards doing something? Or was this always an exercise of sort of paying lip service to the element of the church that the progressive element of the church that says you're not listening to us and you need to get with the sign of the times? In other words, was there actually a substantive vision of change here? Or was this always a sort of, let's just sort of get together and talk so people feel included?
Well, to answer that question requires pointing out that a misconception about the Vatican is that it's this monolithic thing, and that the Pope really does control the entire apparatus. No, he does not, and the Vatican is not a single monolithic thing. So to talk about the aims of the synod, you really have to look at it in the plural, and you have to realize that there's a whole political world in the curial offices as you're running up to the synod. And so there were probably a multiplicity of aims from various quarters of the Vatican as to what the synod was about, and many of them were probably at odds with one another. What Pope Francis actually wanted from this synod is anybody's guess. But there are two schools of thought, and with regard to what maybe Pope Francis was looking for. The first one is, I think, somewhat likely now in hindsight, what you just said, which was that he wanted to give people a voice who have not had much of a voice, at least in the Pope's opinion, to let them have their day in court, to let them have their say. But I would say that in some ways that's infantilizing. To just let them have their say, only to ignore them at the end of the day, is an even bigger slap in the face. Second, the assumption that they haven't had their day in court, that they haven't had their voice heard, is absurd. Anybody involved in the Theological Guild knows that even with the pontificates of JP2 and Benedict, the Theological Guild has been absolutely dominated by these voices. Just try and get tenured at most Catholic universities if you're a conservative right. Catholic theologian. It's not going to happen. You have to be a liberal progressive in so many Catholic theological schools in order to get any kind of tenure or advancement. So if that was the aim, to simply, these poor downtrodden liberals who have never been heard by the church, it's a stupid aim, because they have been heard by the church. Oh Lord, we've never been heard here. We're finally being heard. No, nonsense, rubbish. It's bollocks, as the British say.
Well, I wonder. I mean, just to push back on that a little bit, I wonder if. I mean, I totally agree with everything you said about like the progressives are the ones who can get the tenure. The progressives are the ones who get invited to be commentators on CNN. They're very much in the mainstream. All of that.
Yeah.
But the progressives obviously also feel like they have been unfairly targeted by JP2 and then Benedict, and now we have this Francis pontificate. And is there a possibility that Pope Francis is seeing himself, rightly or wrongly, sort of reaching to the margins of those who feel disaffected by the chair of St. Peter, by all these progressives
I think that's exactly what he's doing, which leads to the second theory. I think a little worse than the first one, that all he was doing was letting them air their voices just so he could smack them down at the end. I think that Pope Francis sympathizes with the progressive wing of the church. In other words, Pope Francis is very orthodox. Don't count me among those who think Pope Francis is a heretic or an illegitimate pope or an anti-pope or anything. He's actually very orthodox, and actually in some ways very conservative. Name one thing on the liberal wish list that this pope has given to them. Yeah. From women priests to women deacons to contraception to even a married clergy, which he could change overnight with the stroke of a pen.
Maybe suppressing the Latin Mass. They probably.
Well, that's what I'm leading up to here, with one exception. Exception, Pope Francis does have a sort of no enemies to the left of me mentality, but he has a long list of enemies to the right of me, and he clearly has a vindictive streak in him with regard to the right side of the church, the conservative side of the church. He doesn't want to hear those voices. In fact, Cardinal Hollerich, the Relator General of the Synod, was just asked point blank, why was it that there were no traditionalist in terms of liturgy voices at the Synod? Why were there no voice? Why was the subject of liturgy and the old Latin Mass and all that not discussed at the Synod? And Cardinal Hollerich flat out told a lie. He said, well, because those people did not speak up. Those people did not speak to us.
That's insane. That's
insane. It's wrong. It's a false. Yeah. It's a lie. He knows it's untrue, and therefore it's a lie.
Right.
I'm just going to say that he's a liar. And he's just trying to save face with the fact that, yes, this pontificate does not like traditional Catholics. Therefore, I do believe that one of the aims of the Synod was an empowering of the progressive wing of the church. This is the dangerous game that Pope Francis is playing, I think. He did not agree with all of the theological conclusions that the progressives are pushing, like women's ordination and that sort of thing. He doesn't agree with that. But he prefers their overall theological ethos to that of the conservative wing of the church. Mm-hmm. Okay, so like a Cardinal McElroy in San Diego, who's openly dissented from the church's teaching on homosexuality. Pope Francis has stated publicly that he stands by the church's traditional teaching on homosexuality. Why then did he give a red hat to McElroy? Because he can't stand the conservative wing of the American Catholic Church. This is, to use a vulgarism here, this is Pope Francis flipping the bird to the American conservative Catholics in giving McElroy a red hat. And I think to a great extent, this was one of his aims at the Synod. It wasn't necessarily to ensconce in the church all these radical changes, but it was, I think, to move the needle in the direction of the ethos of progressivism, if I can put it that way. And that's, like I said, dangerous. That Pope Francis wants to have his cake and eat it too. He
Yep.
wants to have the pastoral latitudinarianism of the progressives, and can't stand what he thinks is the parsimonious finger wagging of the conservatives. But he doesn't, for all that, want the final theological conclusions of the
Yeah.
progressives. That's the fundamental incoherence of this papacy.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. One, I think it was also in the opening dispatch from the Synod from Weigel, where he talked about this communal penance service that was for Synod participants. I don't.
Yeah.
Did you have the privilege of participating in this liturgy?
No, I did not participate in it, but I talked to people who were, and
Okay.
read all the press briefings, there in Rome that were coming out about it. I mean, what was ludicrous about it was, of course, one of the sins was, how have I sinned against synodality?
Yeah, well,
But George and I both pointed out, and I said this to George in his apartment, and we both got a chuckle out of this. Like, maybe if the Vatican would define for us what synodality is
Right.
in the first place,
we could know
then I would know. I mean, you're invincibly ignorant right out of the gate, because I don't even know what synodality is. So if I don't know what it is, how can I be sinning against it?
Right. It would just be a venial sin, of course, right at that point.
Yeah.
So there was another one too that I think one of the publicly stated sins in that liturgy was something like using dogma as a means of casting stones, or like something just something very meaningless.
This is what I'm talking about with regard to Pope. Pope Francis believes in dogmas. He does.
Yeah, of course.
He has reinforced certain dogmas, but what he doesn't like are people who quote dogmas. This, once again, the fundamental. He doesn't like the fact that the conservative wing of the church will hold up the dogmatic truths of the church as things that, Catholics really ought to take seriously and believe.
Right.
He finds that to be a kind of judgmentalism. Now, are there little mini me inquisitors? No, mini me. We don't bite the kitty. We don't bite the heretics. Yeah. There are some like this, the kind of Catholic. They act like they've been eating green lemons their whole life. They're sourpusses and all this. Yeah. But really, seriously, what church have you been living in for the past 60 years? If you think the main problem that confronts the Catholic Church in Western culture is an overbearing moralism, a staunch dogmatism. I mean, in fact, the danger of our parishes over the past 60 years is the exact opposite.
Yeah.
A runaway latitudinarianism, a runaway relativism, a runaway horizontalism and sociologism and psychologism. Show me a parish that's browbeating people with dogma and so forth. But this is the image that Pope Francis sort of conjures up. The image of a church that's stuck in the Inquisition or something. So he believes in dogmas. He just doesn't want us to use them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've helped me. It was several years ago. You basically articulated your belief that to best understand Pope Francis, you need to understand something about South American Catholicism. And I think there is this way of interpreting him that really holds a good interpretive key. We often talk about how Americans perceive Pope Francis, and there's this idea of American conservatives basically not giving him the benefit of the doubt when interpreting him, because all of what they do interprets him in a very American Catholic context. And that's probably true to at least some extent. But then there's this other question that you raised, which is basically, is Pope Francis influenced by Americanism? Or that's probably not that's not the right phrase, but is Pope Francis influenced by American Catholicism, right? And does that drive him to behave a certain way? Does he basically do things to be interpreted by Americans in a certain way?
I do. I think he has a special. This is purely speculation on my part, but others have shared this speculation, right? I think he has a special animus against not just the American Catholic Church, but the United States in general. I don't think he has any time whatsoever for American war hawks, American neocons, Americans of the Reagan sort of Ronald Reagan political spectrum. Remember, he's a South American. He's an Argentinian. He's 88 years old. He he remembers. I mean, let's put it this way, okay? It's not without a certain legitimation. I understand Latin America. I've lived in
Yeah,
Latin
for
America.
sure. Yeah.
Okay, in 1973, the United States CIA overthrew the legitimately elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, who just so happened to be a Marxist. Okay, and because he was a Marxist, we had him assassinated. Actually, okay, or was it assassinated or just overthrown? And then he was I don't remember which. But in other words, he was overthrown and replaced with a puppet regime. Pinochet,
Yep.
anybody?
Yep.
A general. And this was a pattern that the United States followed throughout Latin America during, say, Oscar Romero, who was assassinated by death goons of the El Salvadoran
Right.
government.
Right.
And it was the Reagan administration that funded the death squads because they were, there was this civil war going on in El Salvador with Cuban style Marxist guerrillas versus the military junta supported by the United States and our corporate interests. You get the point. You get where I'm going. The United States has not had a stellar record in dealing with Latin American countries. And Pope Francis is no idiot. Jorge Bergoglio, I think, really has a resentful Yankee go home kind of mentality towards the United States, a typical South American gigantic chip on his shoulder with regard to the United States. I think, therefore, when he sees conservative American Catholics, he sees people that quite frankly, he just loathes and despises. And he's going to go out of his way to cut them off at the legs. And he's going to go out of his way to do things that makes them uncomfortable. I really hate to put it in such psychological categories, but I really do believe that goes a long way towards explaining his fundamental incoherence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very possible. But to your point too, it's also not entirely illegitimate. I think some of those views are justified, or at the very least, I can understand why a South American
Oh yeah.
would view America
Oh
that way.
yeah.
It is,
Absolutely.
if your view of America is shaped mostly by the way that Dick Cheney sees the world, for example, you're going to have a pretty rough view of America. And so, yeah, I in some ways I can't
Yeah.
fault the Holy Father for having that orientation if that is indeed the case.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I have no problem with Pope Francis having a sort of let's casting a jaundiced eye at
Yeah.
anything American because of his history. I have no problem with that. That's human. But when that gets translated into, I mean, let's put it this way: confirmation bias. In other words,
Sure.
we tend to listen to those people that confirm our biases, and I think there are people who surround Pope Francis, like especially some Jesuits like Anthony Spadaro and others, who have fed Pope Francis a bag of lies, if you want to put it that way, about what the American Catholic Church is like. Remember, Jorge Bergoglio, I don't even know if Pope Francis has ever visited the United States
I'm not
as
sure
a
either.
human.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very, very clear. In other words, he doesn't speak English, and so he doesn't read the Anglophone documents or writings and so forth, or watch American. So, I think he's extremely ignorant of America by and large. And I think, therefore, he's uniquely prone to having his views of the United States formed by those who surround him with regard to the American Catholic Church. And so, what he was told, I think, by so many advisors is, the American Catholic Church is just this hotbed of right wing Catholic dissent from Vatican II, dissent from the Novus Ordo, dissent from everything you stand for. They're all a bunch of Lefebvreites. They're all SSPX type people. Yeah, you get the picture.
Well,
That's
this explains why he has chosen to sort of move away from the traditional C's for the red hat and give red hats to the people who presumably
yes,
are in his inner circle
yes,
or inner circle of his inner circle, like McElroy, obviously Supich, and why he's given Supich a primo position on the Council for Bishops, who's responsible for choosing new bishops in the United States.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, it seems like a very plausible explanation to me.
Well, and I think too, Zach, that the bishops like Supich, Cardinal Tobin, Cardinal Gregory, Cardinal McElroy, these bishops that have the Pope's favor, I think they know that this is the Pope's image of America, and they love the fact that this is his image of
course,
America,
because it
and
acquits
so,
them.
so
they
when
play
they
very well
show
in that
up,
light.
yeah, exactly, and when they show up on his doorstep to have consultations with him, they simply reinforce that image of the American Catholic Church, as a hotbed of right-wing reactionary sentiment. I mean, it explains why, for example, you've got Bishop Stowe in Kentucky, very, very, very liberal Franciscan who's gay this, gay that, gay, LGBTQ, LGBTQ, yeah, who gets away with murder in his diocese in terms of flaunting the church's sexual teaching. But then you have Bishop Strickland down in Tyler, Texas, who gets an apostolic visitation. He gets removed from his see, and now the Vatican has slapped back all Latin masses other than FSSP masses in the Diocese of Tyler, Texas.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Why the overkill in Strickland, and that in Strickland's case, and in Tyler, why the overkill there? And I'm no Strickland fan, trust me.
That's what I was going to say. Is that it's not that I'm against the apostolic visitation for Strickland. I just want them both to get an apostolic visitation. I want them both.
Yeah,
to be,
I mean, yeah, exactly.
If you're publicly flouting the Holy Father's teaching, if you're publicly flouting the Church's teaching, if you're publicly sowing confusion among the faithful, then you should not be a bishop.
But you know what, Zach? This just seems to be the way the Vatican goes. I remember when John Paul was Pope, the Vatican sent apostolic visitations to very, very liberal American bishops, like Hunthausen up in Seattle got a visitation, and a couple others got a visitation. Now we have a more, liberal Pope, if you want to call him. And so the conservative guys are getting the visitations. And so I guess this is just the way the pendulum swings. You just wish that the visitations were, uniformly applied.
So, this I don't want to psychologize the Holy Father, but it's helpful to just think about the context in which he was formed, and that maybe helps us understand how he sees the world. When we talk about that, I wonder if the Synod on Synodality then becomes a way for him to sort of un-Americanize the global church. If he's looking at the pontificates of JP2 and of Benedict, perhaps he thinks that those are too continental. They were formed too much by continental ideas, and maybe the Synod on Synodality for him was always about sort of unmaking the church in this sort of American European mold and opening it up to the global South more. And I wonder if, as they did that, it became apparent that that just wasn't going to happen, or that the outcomes that were desired by the people trying to hijack the process weren't actually going to be the outcomes that happened. And so it just sort of ended with a whimper.
I think that the latter is more true than the former. I have a very, very hard time accepting the idea that the Synod was an attempt at moving the church away from a fixation on Europe and North America and towards the global South. Because
you think it was not that?
It was not that at all. Okay. Because I mean, the fact of the matter is, a very Eurocentric council. We get Synod, very Eurocentric.
Fair.
Why was the Relator General of the Synod made from a cardinal Jesuit, by the way, from Luxembourg, a place where the Catholic Church is damn near dead?
That is a pretty remarkable choice to choose the places that have the most dead churches and say, how about you?
33% of the Synod voters were Jesuits. 33%.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
What?
Jesuit. It was a Jesuit Synod.
They might as well just call it the Synod on Jesuitry.
Go back to my First Things diaries. One of the diaries, maybe the second, third one, was a detailing of the
I missed that. I read 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 or something. I must have missed that one.
Probably was 3. It was about the outsized influence of the Jesuits at the council.
33%.
I believe 33% was the percentage of synodal voters who are Jesuits. And the Jesuit led the darn thing from a country where Catholicism is dead. In fact, I spoke to an African who was a voting member of the Synod, who said that the African delegation is, both last year and this year, has complained bitterly of being excluded from the process, that the issues that seem to be front and center at the Synod are not issues that concern the African Church
of course,
at all.
Yeah, not surprising.
These are issues that are the obsessions of the sexually licentiate cultures of the first world, of the north, of the global north. Like gender, who gets ordained, power, sex, LGBTQ. The African Church Yeah. The African church.
The African church is like, how do we not get our heads chopped off by?
Yeah. Well, not
Islamic
only
terrorists?
that, here's the deal. And this is key that we understand this. It helps to explain why they so viscerally pushed back against fiducia supplicans. In Africa, the Catholic Church has two main rivals: Islam and evangelical Pentecostal Protestant sects.
Yeah.
And the constant theme that they drum home is that the Catholic Church is a hotbed of sexual immorality. All right? And that it's just simply Anglicanism in a different garb with the Pope. Okay. And so when Fiducia Supplicans comes out, or when the Synod on Synodality keeps talking about gay blessings, all right, they have to go back. They have to go back to Africa and look at the propaganda that is coming their way. And in the case of the African church, the propaganda can be violent and it can be deadly.
Yeah.
All right. And so this is the thing. For us, these disputes are, no skin off our back, and okay,
Sort of
we're just dialoguing, we're just talking here. But to the Africans, it has deadly consequences.
That's fascinating.
All right, and so no, this was not a synod that in any way, shape, or form was trying to de-Eurocize the church, reach out the peripheries, include the peripheries, because whenever the peripheries rose up to say we don't agree with that, the synod leaders were quick to smack them down in very paternalistic, condescending ways.
Now,
right?
I agree with all that.
Like the stupid idiot new Cardinal Radcliffe, that Dominican
Timothy Radcliffe,
Timothy Radcliffe, who came out and said, well, you got to understand the Africans are influenced by big Russian money, American money, Pentecostal American money, Russian money, Islamic money. This is what, that's what swayed the Africans against fiducia supplicans. Now, he had to backtrack almost immediately when the Africans rose up and said, you raging racist nitwit, how dare you claim such a thing, when in point of fact, you want to talk about the Rhine flowing into the Tiber? Why is there such an outsized influence of the Germans in almost everything the church does when it's a dying church? Why? Because they're the rich church. Mm-hmm. They're the church with the multi-billion-dollar church tax that has the money to give to the Vatican by the billions to the Vatican to make up for their deficit. Okay. So Radcliffe, that's what the Africans say to him. Why don't you talk about German money flowing into the Vatican, and then shut your pie hole about us, because you don't know what you're talking about. So this had nothing. I'm getting really hot under the collar here, because I tell you what, this not only, I'm big about, the African church and the Latin American church and the Asian church and the church from the global South and so on. This is the future of the church. And yet we had this synod on synodality, the reins of which were handed over to a group of aging secularist Europhiles. And the issues that they raised are dead on arrival and have nothing to do with the vital centers of the church's life and the issues that those centers face. And so, it irritates the heck out of me, because Rome is fiddling while the church burns.
Yeah.
That's,
I mean, I can't disagree with any of that. I going back to the sort of, was it for the global South idea? I do wonder, though, if there's a possibility that Pope Francis, who's aging, 88 years old now, I think, right?
88 in December. Yeah,
he's really getting up there. And obviously at that age, it's very difficult to be an effective administrator, or at least to effectively have a hand in all the various initiatives that you have going on. So is there a world, you think, in which he wants to include the global South? I mean, he's from Argentina. I really have a hard time believing he is not interested in doing that and really just wants to strengthen the German lobby, for example. But is there a world in which he says, hey, we should do the Synod and Synodality, we should incorporate the global South, we should listen to the Christians where Christianity is exploding? And then he, hands that off to his lieutenants, who then say, like, okay, call the Luxembourgians and call the Germans. We're gonna do this. Here's a great opportunity to advance some of our agenda. Do you think that's possible, or is that not the case?
It's possible. It's as possible as any other scenario.
Yeah.
Given and I keep coming back to this idea, Zach, but I think it's so true. The fundamental problem with this papacy is that the Petrine ministry is there in order to unify the church by clarifying disputed matters.
Yeah.
What this Pope does is he muddies the water instead.
He disputes
He
clarified matter, or he doesn't
yeah,
dispute them, but he sort of
he makes it seem as if clarified matters are open for dispute.
right.
That's my number one, but also more to the point. There's this, as I keep saying, this fundamental incoherence between what he says and what he does. So he can say all he wants, that he wants the synod to be about the church's peripheries, but then what he does is he makes, like I said, octogenarians from Europe leaders of the synod. Okay, and you say, well, why is that? Why not take the best and the brightest from the African church, the Asian church, the South American church, and make them the head of the synod, and send the dead European churches packing? Tell the Germans to go pound sand. Tell the French to go pound sand. For crying out loud, the only places where the Catholic Church is alive in those regions is in the more conservative pockets of Catholicism.
Of course, yeah.
The liberal pockets are dead or dying.
I mean, there are entire dioceses in France that have not a single seminary or just single man in seminary formation.
Nobody. And what is the Vatican doing? Actively suppressing the few places in France where there are vocations.
Right.
What's the diocese? You maybe would know.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
it's a tradition. It's a diocese where they were promoting the Latin Mass,
Yep.
and they had tons of seminarians. And the Vatican has intervened with an apostolic visitation and put the kibosh on their ordinations.
Yeah. I think it's in southern France.
How unfair to those seminarians. Having been a seminarian myself, you get to the brink of ordination after all those years of hard work, and your family is behind you and then some fembot from the Vatican shows up and says, "You guys can't do this. So just chill your jets here. We're not going to ordain you just yet." And then you exist in limbo for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. Think of the fundamental injustice of that.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's horrible. Yeah, I certainly can't disagree with that at all. Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's frustrating from the outside in. I am certainly grateful that the synod, as you said, ended up being a nothing burger. I, at one point, certainly held reservations or concerns that it would end up being a Trojan horse for those with the worst malign intentions of the church and those who wanted to undercut some of our most profound teachings on Christology and on our sacraments. I would say that my concern never rose above the level of discomfort. I was never really anxious about it. I was certainly never fearful of it. It never seemed like a very realistic scenario, but it did seem like there were some malign actors who wanted to do some bad things, and I'm glad that they seemed to not win the day by any stretch.
Yeah, there were some bad actors who wanted to do some bad things, and it turns out that there were a lot of good actors who did some good things. There were far more people. There's still a lot of green sap in the tree of the church.
Yeah,
the church is alive and well. It really is. I hate to be. I'm pessimistic about things that come out of the current Vatican and so forth. I'll tell you, the church has tons of problems, but man, it's alive and well. It's in better shape than most, Protestant churches in the United States and Europe.
Well, I was going to ask you something similar. I mean, having gone now to the synod and being able to, were you a fly on the wall in the room, or was your information just gleaned from conversations with participants in between sessions and all that?
Participants in between sessions. I was not a fly on the wall in the room. I just had meetings with people who were synod participants.
Got it.
And then also regular meetings with fellow journalists who were over there, who had their own conversations with synod participants. Yep. So the journalists would get together and pool their common knowledge. So I talked to so-and-so. Oh, well, I talked to so-and-so.
Yep.
And we would compare notes and so forth. Now, of course, everything synod members told us was off the record because they were sworn to secrecy. And so we could not name names. And you had to be careful not to let it leak who you had dinner with or who you had had lunch with, so that when you did eventually write about things, people didn't put two and two together.
Understand,
and say, "Oh, Chapp's talking about so and so."
So, why was there an order of secrecy over this? That seems like a bad idea if you want to have want to have listening, and this is transparency and a listening church. Why would you shroud everything in secrecy?
Well, especially in comparison, Pope Francis is not the first person to have synod of bishops.
Of course.
Pope John Paul had synod of bishops. Benedict had synod of bishops. And in previous, under those pontificates, the synod of bishops, and I think even in previous synods under Francis, all the synod participants could talk all they want. Copies of the speeches given by synod participants at the synod were made public and published on the Vatican website. And so it was all open. It was all transparent. But you get to the synod on synodality, and all of a sudden it's Get Smart's cone of silence that came down over everybody's head, and it's verboten. You may not speak about this. Why? Well, in theory, it was they wanted people to be able to speak freely on the synod floor, to offer their opinions without any public blowback, any public repercussions that Cardinal so-and-so said such and such. But that's just silly because it leaked out anyway.
Yeah, right.
And exactly. This is the Vatican. Telephone, telegraph, tell somebody that works in the Vatican. I mean, for crying out loud, what level of historic naivete do you have to think that an event at the Vatican is going to not have leaks about, what's amazing. Going on inside the synod? Right. We all knew what was said at the synod, regardless of this cone of silence that was stupidly imposed.
Were there any personalities that you know of, based on your reporting and the conversations you had with attendees and participants? Were there any participants who were actively, gloves off or mask off, whatever the expression would be, advocating for changes to church teaching on a given topic? Or was it all just more of the sly suggesting here and just asking questions?
It was the sly suggesting, asking of questions. To my knowledge, there were no bishops or lay people that stood up and flat out said, hey, we need to have gay marriage in the church, or, hey, I think there were some people that stood up and said, yes, it's time to have the ordination of women to the diaconate. I think that's the most forward that people were. And there was nothing scandalous about that. That was a topic that was on the table. And so if somebody was in favor of that, they stood up and said so. But some of the other more sensitive things, like, the normalization of homosexual relations, that was more, let's talk around the topic, talk around it. Nobody stood up and flat out said, hey, I think the church is full of crap on sex, Nobody said that.
Well, at least, I mean, it's a good sign, at least, that they're not that emboldened at this point, right? They fear for their careers.
I think that one of the things that Pope Francis did that was both good and bad was that before the synod even started, he said no to women's ordination.
Right.
When Nora O'Donnell of 60 Minutes asked him, "Can your little girl being born today?"
It was one of the funniest 60 Minutes answers I've seen.
I know, because he just
a little girl who's so hopeful that she could one day see a future where she could be ordained.
No,
and he leans forward. He pauses and he leans forward.
No. He emphatically, and then also in numerous statements before the synod, he made it very, very clear.
Yeah.
That the church is not going to change its teaching on homosexuality either. And so that took kind of some of the wind out of the progressive sails even before. So I think they felt like, okay, we now know where the boss stands.
Right.
In fact, like theologians who are pro women's ordination, like Phyllis Zagano, who was on the committee looking into female was very, very bitter. And the former Taoiseach of Ireland, McKellen and McEwen, I can't think of her last name now, who's very, very outspoken women's ordination sort of Catholic, and she's been they came out and they bitterly denounced Pope Francis's no to women's ordination as a violation of the synodal process and all this kind of stuff. So I do think that Pope Francis's strong statements muted some of the more emboldened people at the synod. So I say that's a good thing. On the other hand, it's a bad thing, because then why have a synod? If what was the point to the whole thing? You invite all these liberals to come onto the synod to talk liberal things, and you give them the impression by talking these issues to death that these are still open subjects. But then right before the synod gets started, you say, "Niet, no." It's just so weird, Zach. It's weird.
Well, maybe this is an alternative hypothesis that maybe it's complementary with what I previously floated, that there's this, Pope Francis wants to include the global South, et cetera, but then the process gets co-opted by all the liberals. And then Pope Francis realizes that it's almost too late, but he realizes that and just is like, okay, no.
Yeah, the theory of co-optation is an interesting one, and other people have floated it that Pope Francis thinks this way, and to give some credence to that idea. I mean, one of the theories as to why Pope Benedict resigned was that his papacy had been co-opted by various forces within the Vatican that he felt like he couldn't control,
Right.
and that his age and weakness couldn't control. So, okay, the theory has some legs, but I still would maintain that if you're Pope Francis and you want to avoid that kind of co-optation, you don't put Cardinal. I keep coming back to this. You don't put Cardinal Hollerich as the Relator General of the Synod. You don't put a known progressive dissenting liberal as the head of the Synod. You appoint a more moderate, middle of the road, like a Cardinal Erdo of Hungary, who's a well-known centrist, and some people hope maybe is the next pope. Maybe that's why you don't make him the next Relator General of the Synod, because he might be the next pope. Who the heck knows? But you get my point. So I don't know. There are things Pope Francis could have done to avoid co-optation of his message of let's go to the peripheries that he didn't do, that he could have done.
The two more questions for you. One, do you think that this is all theater for the participants? In other words, is there any actual learning? Is there openness to changing one's views when you're at these things, do you think? Or is it all just, I have my agenda, I'm with my guys, the sort of lavender mafia idea that this is our camp and this is our approach here. We're gonna coordinate. We all know the right things to say to beat around the bush to get to what we're getting at.
Well, one of the things I think is a combination of a lot of what you just said. One of the things that I talked, of course, mainly to a bunch of conservative Synod members.
Sure.
But one of the routine statements that they did make was that it was actually very nice to get to know a lot of the more liberal types, that they had only known by reputation or through their writings, and to see that they're not dragon breathing, jerks from hell.
That's great. Yeah.
That they were decent, loving, kind, generous human beings. Good Catholics in their own way, sincere Catholics in their own way. Yeah. And so, it's never a bad thing to get to know other human beings. It's never a bad thing to meet your interlocutors, to meet your enemies, if you want to put it that way. That's never a bad thing. And that is one of the good things I think that came from the Synod.
Great.
And I think it went both ways too. If I know that from talking with more conservative members, I'm sure that there were more liberal members of the Synod who felt like they met some more, and they thought, well, you're not so bad after all. We can have but at the end of the day, all that said, I think people came with their own agendas and their own ideas, and they left with their agendas and ideas intact.
Yep.
I don't think anybody had their points of view swayed or changed by synodal conversation. Not at all.
Fair. Okay. Final question for you as we wrap this up. You mentioned, the future of the church is bright. There's plenty of green sap, et cetera. But it's got to be frustrating to go to Rome and see all of the subterfuge and hear about these various people in the church who are trying to change things and want to remake the church in their own image. But what words would you have of hope for people who are listening to this and just like, oh, this is so frustrating. Why are these people trying to do this?
What would you say? I had one of my first things diaries focused on a seagull. I don't know if you remember that.
I've read that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was waiting in line to go to the Vatican to pray for a dear friend who was very sick. I was going to pray at the tomb of John Paul. And I was standing there and I'm looking, those fountains that are in St. Peter's Square. If you've ever been there, two beautiful fountains. And I posted the picture, on one fountain was a single seagull. And he or she was up there. It was a hot day, and obviously enjoying the mist and the water. And he stood up there for the whole time I was in line, just really enjoying. And it struck me, you know what? That fountain has been in this square for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And there have been seagulls coming to do just what that dude's doing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it goes on despite what's going on in the building behind them. And I thought that's a metaphor for how we need to approach these goings on, that we need to take the long view. we need to understand, all right, that this too shall pass, all right, that worse shenanigans than this have gone on in the Vatican. And that the church is a millennia old institution that has survived worse than this, and it will survive this. And so, not to get to be more like that seagull, simply basking in the cool mist and the beauty of St. Peter's. And I stood there, and I actually had this overwhelming sense of well-being that came over me as I looked then from the seagull up to St. Peter's and thought, Peter is here. Peter is here. And, the gates of hell shall not prevail. And it gave me consolation. So that's how we just need to pray. We just need to be Catholics. Feed your kids, go to work, go to mass, do your prayers, and not concern ourselves too much with all of this. Because as Pope John the 23rd used to pray right before he'd go to bed, he prayed, "Church, Lord, it's your church. I'm going to bed now."
That's beautiful. I have heard that story before. Yeah, that's fantastic.
I don't think it's an apocryphal story. I think it's actually true.
No, I've heard, I think I told you this story before. John the 23rd was also visited by a bunch of cardinals and bishops. And in this particular visit, there were all the cardinals and bishops in a line for their visit. And there was a priest who was traveling with them. I think probably, traveling just as an assistant of one of the bishops or something. And he's going down the line and everyone's, kissing the ring, et cetera, and introduce themselves. I'm Cardinal so-and-so, I'm Bishop so-and-so. And he comes to the priest, and the priest says, "Oh, Holy Father, I'm just a lowly parish priest." And John the 23rd gets down and kisses his hand and says, "That's where the souls are." So that's a pretty cool story.
Well, if you ever read The Journal of the Soul by Pope John the 23rd, he's a genuine saint. It's a beautiful thing. There's also an anecdote kind of related, but not so much to what we're talking about, where somebody once asked Pope John the 23rd, and this too is true, Pope John, Your Holiness, how many people work in the Vatican? And he said, "Oh, about half of them."
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
Because, it's a very Italian thing. You get to work about 10 a.m., you work until about 1 p.m., then you go to lunch, and then you're done. And in some ways, you asked my last thoughts. It's to remember, this is the Vatican we're talking about. Yeah. And it's notoriously inefficient. And maybe there's some hope in that.
For sure. Yeah, no doubt. That's really funny. Well, thanks so much, Larry. This is a great overview. It sounds like you have affirmed. I appreciate this. You affirmed my decision to basically tune out most of what the Synod is doing. So
unless they resurrect it in some way, I think it's done.
Amazing. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the overview. Thanks for writing the dispatches. I encourage all my listeners and viewers to go check out First Things diary, the Synod diary that Larry wrote, part of the Letters from the Synod with George Weigel. So great stuff. Larry, thanks so much. Good luck to you. For my prayers with you as you prepare your farm for winter in Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah, we need it too. Thank you.
We've had a mild fall so far here in the upper Midwest. I mean, you felt our weather when you were visiting for the conference. It was very mild and sunshine.
Mild and dry. Yeah, we need rain actually.
Yeah, we need some rain as well. So maybe soon. But I'm grateful for the mild weather so far. But it'll turn cold soon enough. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Larry. God bless you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Zach.
Absolutely. Have a great one. To my listeners, thanks so much for watching. Once again, send me any notes. I can forward any notes to Larry as well. Zac, Z-A-C, @creedalpodcast.com. And until next time, God bless you.